If you would be turning your Bibles to Judges chapter 6, that's where we will start tonight. Judges chapter 6. And let's just read the first 6 verses together. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. And so if you're familiar with the Judges, you know there's this ebb and flow throughout the book where Israel turns away from God. After so long, they cry out to the Lord. The Lord sends a judge to rescue them. And after a little while, they turn away from God again, and the cycle just repeats itself. And if we flipped back just before this, we would be reading about Deborah, the judge that God sent who rescued them. And so there's really no in between the end of Deborah's song there in chapter 5 and what happened as far as Deborah was concerned, and where the writer picks up in chapter 6, simply saying, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so they are 7 years into this punishment. It's what it really is. It's a punishment for turning away from God. And God allowed the Midianites and the Amalekites to oppress his people. And basically what they were doing is they were allowing the Israelites to sow their crops, and then when the crops came to ready to be harvested, they would move into the land, take the crops from them, tear up their land, kill their livestock. And as we read there in verse 6, they had so impoverished the Israelites. They had taken everything from them, everything they needed to sustain themselves, that they finally cry out to the Lord. In verse 7, when the Israelites cried to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." And so when Israel cries out, God's answer is to send them a prophet. And that prophet gives them this message. You know, I took you up out of the land of Egypt. I drove out the people before you in this land. I gave you this land as your own. But I told you, don't worship the gods of that land. But you didn't listen. And because you didn't listen, you're suffering the consequences of not listening to my word. And then in verse 11, we see the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, get this picture. The Midianites are oppressing the Israelites. Gideon has found him some wheat, and he's hiding in a wine press, threshing his wheat so the Midianites won't take it from him. In about as lowly a position as a person could be in, probably. And he was probably really hungry. And the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, what? The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, do you think Gideon felt like a mighty warrior as he was hiding in the wine press threshing his wheat? I'm going to guess probably not. And his response is, "But sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" And what Gideon's saying is, my people always say, the Lord is with us, the Lord is with us. But if the Lord is with us, why is all this happening to us? And the answer is, God didn't turn away from you. You turned away from God. And that's why this is happening to you. Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, "Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." And so Gideon says, I've heard about all these stories of the wonders that God did in bringing my people up out of Egypt. And that tells us something, doesn't it? That those events that took place during that time had been passed down generation by generation by generation. And even as we get down to Gideon, he has heard the stories of the wonders of God that he did in his people. But his question is, his statement is, "But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." So think about what Gideon is saying. Hey, I've heard about these wonders of the Lord, but I haven't seen any. Especially not in these last 7 years. I haven't seen any evidence of who God is supposed to be, who my people say He is. In fact, from my perspective, He has completely abandoned His people. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Now again, Gideon is hiding in a wine press, threshing what little wheat he could find. And the message comes to him, "Go in the strength you have to save Israel from Midian." Now, if you are Gideon and you're hiding in a wine press, and this person comes to you and says, "Go in the strength you have and save your people from this oppressive army that for 7 years has been totally dominating you in every way, form, and fashion," what thoughts are going through your mind?
Can't do it.
Okay, you must be crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Or, if I could have done that, don't you think I already would have?
Right.
And so, in what seems to be abject weakness, for the second time, this messenger from God is saying, you can go do something that you don't have right now there's no way you could fathom that you could do. And then he asks the question, am I not sending you? Am I not the one empowering you? Am I not the one commissioning you? I am the one sending you. And just like Moses, the next words out of Gideon's mouth is, "But Lord, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." So think about what Gideon's saying there. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. And by the way, Manasseh was a half-tribe. The two sons of Joseph were half-tribes that made up a tribe. And so he's saying, I'm from the least tribe, I'm the least, and my clan is the least in the tribe, and I'm the least in my clan. He's saying, I am the least of the least of the least. And God's answer to that is, I will be with you. I'll be with you. And notice he says, and you will strike down all the Midianites together. I will be with you, but you're going to be the one who will strike down the Midianites. But it's going to be us together. You working with my power. And Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign. Does that sound familiar? You ever notice how many people, as they're discussing with God or an angel, ask for signs? What did Jesus say about asking for signs?
That there would be no sign other than his 3 days in the earth.
All right. And to those who ask for a sign, he said, you adulterous generation. All right? You ask for a sign. But as was the case with Moses, actually I don't think Moses asked. I think God just gave him the first sign, didn't he? But Gideon asked, hey, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Now, I find that really interesting because, you know, in the hierarchy of the world we live in, more important people should never wait on lesser people, right? If I'm going for a job interview and I'm going to interview with someone, the last thing I want to do is keep them waiting. I do not want to be late for an interview. That's probably going to cost me any chance of getting that job. But here the angel of the Lord tells this person who's hiding in a wine press, go ahead, I'll wait on you. Go get your offering and come back. Gideon went in and prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast, putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, and he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. And the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. And with the tip of the staff that was in his hand, the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. And when Gideon realized it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, Ah, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. So here Gideon says, hey, wait, let me go get an offering. Fine, I'll wait. He brings it, puts it on the rock. The angel reaches out with staff, touches the rock. Fire comes out of the rock, enough fire to consume meat.
Scares him to death.
And he realizes this is no ordinary person he's talking to, and says, hey, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. So evidently, Gideon felt, and probably was a prevalent teaching, that you see an angel face to face and you might not make it through that experience. But his peace is quelled by the words of the Lord. Now let's jump down to verse 33. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. When the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet summoning the Abiezrites to follow him, he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. And Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew. And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. And so that's one of those old Bible class lessons we learned as a child, wasn't it? But what's the real lesson here from Gideon's perspective? What's the lesson?
God can.
Okay. God can do whatever there is that can possibly be done. I heard somebody over here about to say something. Didn't I?
I always thought he was kind of disrespectful to me, having to be shown twice.
Okay. And actually, that's his third sign, right? Because
Yeah.
of his offering that was burned up.
With Moses, God brought water from the rock, and here he brought fire.
Okay. That's a good point. Melvin said with Moses, God brought water from the rock. Here, he brought fire from the rock. Again, showing that God's power is limitless. If you're in Gideon's place, do you blame him for wanting signs? Think about, what has God commissioned him to do?
Impossible.
To defeat an army that has been oppressing his country for 7 years. Pretty tall task.
We also understand that it took him, that 7 years didn't just automatically be the time that God was disappointed. There was some time that God probably had to show that space, if you can, around there. So it's been a long time, probably, since Gideon had any thoughts about it.
It's a great point. Yeah, we don't know how many years have really transpired between Deborah and this taking place. Let me ask you this. Are you and I ever a little bit like Gideon? Lord, I don't know if this is right or not. Could you just make something happen so I'll know which way to go here? Give me some kind of indication of what the right decision is. Ever prayed anything like that?
I think it's real easy to see his initial, indecision, or I'm not sure about this. But, he kept on wanting a sign. I would like to think that maybe when I saw the fire come
That would be sign enough?
It's easy for me to say that now. But yeah, I totally understand his doubt or indecision because we've all been in a spot where we just didn't really know what.
Who we could trust, what we could trust, yeah.
I'm kind of like Jeremy. I'd like to see one sign, but I don't know. 3 signs, that's kind of overkill, isn't it?
So let me ask you this. Does this show, in what we've looked at so far, do you see Gideon's faith growing any, or do you see his faith just being stagnant
During the 3,
from everything we've read up to this point?
kind of staying the same.
Okay? On the surface, it looks like doesn't have a great deal of faith, does it?
Called all these people together. I mean, he did something to convince them to assemble.
Okay.
And so you have to believe that his faith is growing, his confidence is growing, but it's just not where it's going to be.
If his faith is growing, it's fixing to get moved.
Okay. You're right. Now, you know the story, Bob. You're ahead of us. But let me throw this out for your consideration. Could it possibly be that in the wine press it was just Gideon? But now he has called other people whose lives he is going to put into jeopardy. And could Gideon be saying, hey, Lord, I'm ready to follow you, but before I commit these people who didn't get to see the fire come out of the rock, before I put them into jeopardy, I need a little more here. I need a little more. I need to see your power again.
He had enough faith and confidence that he had gone and tore down the altar of his father
That's right. We didn't read that. We jumped over that.
to another god and then, made an altar of God out of that.
Okay. So
So there had to be something, but he's still working, he's not there yet.
not there yet, but I can kind of see some faith growing in Gideon from the wine press to this. From calling these people together, tearing down the altar. Now, he wasn't real brave about that, but he did it nonetheless. And kind of hung his dad out to dry on it a little bit. But in certain terms, I think we see some faith growth on the part of Gideon. And then in chapter 7, verse 1, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. And the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. So when Gideon put out this call to Manasseh and Asher and Naphtali, 32,000 men answered the call. And God says, you go tell everyone who's a little afraid to go fight that they can go home if they want to. And 22,000 of them took him up on it, which leaves him with 10,000. Now, if you're Gideon, and you started out with 32, and you knew the odds were stacked against you then, and God tells you to do this, and now you're down to 10, how are you feeling about now? Not real good, are you? But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water. I will sift them for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. Now I want us to shift to our Sunday morning class just a minute. In the last couple of weeks we've been talking about election or predestination or whatever. And we made the point this past Sunday that God was not predestining specific people. He was predestining according to a plan. Now listen to what's happening here. God says, Gideon, I want you to go down, take these men down to this stream of water, and if one man doesn't need to go with you, I'll say he can't go, and if another one needs to go, I'm going to say he needs to stay and fight. But then does God pick individual men, or what does he do? And I'm not going to read it because we know the story, right? Take them down to the water, have them drink. If they get down and put their face in the water and drink like a dog, tell them to go home. If they cup their hands and bring it up to their face, they get to stay. So he told Gideon, I'll tell you which man I want and which one I don't want, as if he was going to elect person by person. But what he did is he said, here's the plan. Here's how you're going to identify the ones you want to keep. Just like under the new covenant, God identifies those who are his according to his plan. And we know that when Gideon followed the instruction of the Lord, he ended up with, well, he lost 9,700. And he ended up with 300. Now, do you think Gideon has become a man of faith at this point? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But even as a man of faith, would we be disappointed in Gideon if Gideon at this point is thinking, okay, God's going to do this with me and 300 others, and we're going to take on the Midianites. He must have some kind of amazing weapon he's going to let us use. Something no one's ever seen before. The enemy can't imagine what God's going to put into our hands. And God tells Gideon, I want you to get a jar and a torch and a trumpet, and that's what you're going to defeat Midian with. And we know that, in fact, let's read beginning in verse 13. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. And when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. And dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. So Gideon has enough faith at this point, after God has told him to. He said, you need to go down near the Midianite camp. And there you'll get a message. And when Gideon went down there, he hears these 2 people talking. 2 Midianite soldiers who are basically saying, obviously didn't know what they were saying, didn't know they were being used by God, I'm sure, but gave Gideon the message he needed to hear. And that is, God has given the Midianites into the hands of the Israelites. And notice in verse 17, watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And Gideon and the 300 men reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands, and the 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. And they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. And when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords, and the army fled. Now, for some reason, I always had in my mind that Gideon and the army of the Lord kind of marched into the Midianite camp. But as I read that, they didn't. They just surrounded it on 3 sides and never left that position. So think for just a little bit about where we first see Gideon, what kind of situation he's in, and where we see him at this point. He's gone from hiding in a wine press to being the commander of a small army, grant you, but the commander of the army of God. And the signs that he had seen, think about how simple they were, especially the 2 that he asked for. A simple piece of fleece. Make it dry while there's dew all around it. Make it wet when there's no dew on the ground. Think that was a big deal for God? Nope. And here, though, with 300 men and the power of God, and I hope we all noticed that it was God who made the Midianites fight against each other, threw them into such chaos that they started fighting one another. And so now we see Gideon, who is no doubt at this point full of faith. He has seen an amazing thing happen, far beyond what he could have compared to the fleece, the signs of the fleece. And more than that, he saw God's working from the beginning of the discussion with the angel up to this point in various ways. You go arrange an army. You cut your army down. You get it down to 300. You go to the Midian, go down to the Midian camp. God is taking Gideon one step of faith at a time and moving him to what becomes the ultimate victory. Any thoughts or comments on this before we move to a couple of New Testament passages that we'll try to tie in to Gideon?
Rick, a thing I take from this story is God picked a lowly man to do it like he usually does.
Great point.
A giant of a man. The other thing is God was patient with him.
Ooh, that's
Being very patient, waiting.
That is a great point. I didn't think about that, Lynn. Really good point.
I'm trying to imagine what it must have sounded like with all those pictures where we don't know, it doesn't tell us what size picture it was.
Right.
Small or
Raymond?
And also Gideon was willing to be led. He never once said, I can't. He trusted in God's direction all the way through. He just needed guidance.
And you know, that's an interesting distinction between he and Moses. I mean, he said, but Lord, I'm just from the least of the least of the least. But he never, like Moses said, I can't do this. You're going to have to get me, I can't speak like you'd like for me to. And so there was never that came from Gideon. That's a good point. Any others?
I like his confidence in the fact that he said God has delivered them into our hands before it even happened.
Great point. And that can only be a statement of faith, right? I mean, that is a bold statement of faith. But he was, again, what does the Hebrews writer say our faith is based on? Evidence. The evidence of things not seen. Had Gideon been given some evidence as he goes through this process? Absolutely. Are you and I given evidence of God's working in our lives? I hope so. I hope we've seen some evidence of that. All right, let's turn to Romans chapter 5. And with kind of Gideon as a backdrop, let's think about what Paul writes here. Beginning in verse 1, therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into His grace in which we now stand. And we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom He has given us. And then verse 6, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless. You think Gideon felt a little powerless there in the wine press? I would think so. At just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And that's what I really want us to try to gain from this tonight, is that God was working in the life of Gideon probably before the winepress, would be my guess. And even though Gideon at that moment probably felt about as powerless as any person could feel, when you're hiding so you don't get your food taken away from you, that's pretty powerless. And when you and I were outside of Christ, I'm going to say there were probably some times we felt pretty powerless, pretty overwhelmed, pretty, impoverished is the word that was used about what the Midianites were doing to the Israelites. But even when we were, even when we were powerless, God was working. He was doing something. And through the death of Christ, dying for the ungodly powerless, He demonstrated His love. And while we were still sinners, while we were still in the winepress, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by His blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through Him? For if when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Not only is this so, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. And one thing that's always intrigued me about what Paul writes there in verse 10, he says, we've been reconciled to him through the death of his Son. And I think we recognize that and realize that it's through the sacrificial death of Christ that we are reconciled to God. But he goes on and says, if we've been reconciled through his death, how much more through his life? Actually, I should be looking at verse 9. How much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? Well, actually, it is verse 10. Shall we be saved through his life? And it's easy for us a lot of times to concentrate on the death of Jesus and the role that plays in our reconciliation. But Paul here brings in the idea, but it was also the life that Jesus lived that allows us to be reconciled to God. It was the fact that he took on flesh, that he became like you and I. It was the fact that he lived for 30 plus years, living life like you and I live life, feeling probably the loss of his father, feeling what it's like to have a physical injury or to be sick. As the Hebrews writer says, basically experiencing everything that we experience. And because of the life that he lived, we can be reconciled to God through his life and through his death. And then real quickly, 2 Corinthians chapter 13. 2 Corinthians chapter 13. Verses 1 through 4. And here again is one of those instances where Paul is kind of defending his apostleship. He said, this will be my third visit to you. Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. I already gave you a warning when I was with you the second time. I now repeat it while absent. On my return, I will not spare those who sinned earlier or any of the others. Since you are demanding proof that Christ is speaking through me, he is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. For to be sure, he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by God's power. Likewise, we also are weak in him, yet by God's power we will live with him to serve you. And so Paul here points even to Jesus and says, listen, he was crucified in weakness. Now, that's not weakness from God's perspective, but that's weakness from man's perspective. Yet he lives by God's power. And what I want to key in on is the last part of verse 4 here. Likewise, we are weak in him, yet by God's power we will live with him, not eternally, even though that would be a true statement, but we will live with him to serve you. So Paul's saying, in our weakness, we don't have to be ineffective or unproductive, that God, even in our weakness, can empower us to serve others, to serve those who are living in the church with us and those outside of the body of Christ. And just like Gideon, who we see in extreme weakness in the beginning, Paul says we're like him. We're like Gideon. We have weaknesses. But we can't just throw up our hands and say, I'm weak and God can't make me strong. Because we have seen in too many instances in the Scriptures where that is just not the case. And Gideon is a great example of that. Gideon could have stayed in the wine press, but he didn't. He got out. He followed God. His faith grew. He listened to what God told him. He obeyed explicitly. And he won one of the most marvelous military battles in the history of mankind. And God can do the very same thing through you and I, if we will allow him. Any thoughts or comments?